I want you to think of the best memory that you have. Maybe it was your wedding day, or the birth of a child, or a promotion that you got, or maybe it was the day that you graduated high school or college. What were you feeling on that best day? You probably felt joy and happiness, celebration. Chances are good that you were probably smiling the whole day. You felt like life couldn't get any better, right? Now I want you to think about your worst memories. I know it's not fun to do that, right? But maybe it was the loss of a job, or maybe it was the end of a relationship, or a bad report from a doctor, or maybe it was the death of someone close to you. Immediately when we think about those dark times, those hard times, those painful times, our hearts can get heavy, our heads can get full of negative thoughts. The look even on our face can change, right? All of our feelings seem to change. The joy that we had before is replaced by sadness. Our happiness is replaced by fear and anxiety. And any celebration that we had now is full of insecurity and questions about the future. Feelings are powerful. They can make life better, or they can make life more difficult. God gave us each the ability to feel things when we go through life, because feelings are there to enhance our life. But have you ever experienced feelings that were so strong and so powerful and so overwhelming and so dark that it felt like they just took control over you and you were trapped in them and stuck in them? And if you've ever felt negative feelings for any length of time, then you know that when life gets dark, it can be hard to see beyond the fog of our feelings. And if you felt stuck there and you felt more of your share of bad things in life, then you know that it can be hard to see anything else. Hope that things could ever change or get better can die there in that darkness when our feelings and our emotions just kind of become our home. Feelings certainly can enhance our life, but those feelings can also become an exit from the life that we want. They can take control over us, and they can steer our life into dark and desperate places. So what should we do when our lives are dark and we're overwhelmed by our emotions and negative feelings? They seem to want to control us. We can't seem to move beyond them or get further past them, and they've taken control, and our life is now in a direction we don't want it to go. We're going to wrestle with that today as we continue our series, Night. And over the last 5 weeks, we've been looking at real people who walk through their own darkness and struggle with their own personal pain and night. And we're looking at what God did for them in that darkness to be encouraged about what God can do for us when we walk through dark times. And whether it was David who felt like he was all alone, or Abraham who felt like his dreams were over, or Moses who just felt defeated, or Naomi and Ruth who just felt like they were forgotten in their darkness. Or last week, like we saw with Samuel, who just needed direction in his life. What we're learning is that when life is dark, that's when God does his best work in our lives, because even though it's dark, with God at our side, we don't have to fear the terror of night or the pestilence that stalks us in the darkness. And so today, as we continue our series, if you are watching and you can't seem to see beyond the way you feel, and it's caused you to give up hope for the future or the life that you want, or the life that God wants for you, I want to introduce you to somebody who knows exactly how that feels. His name is Elijah. And from his story today, we're going to see how even if life is dark, God wants to give you a new perspective so your feelings and your fears don't keep you from moving forward in your life. Now, Elijah was one of the greatest prophets in the history of ancient Israel. He was bold and fearless. He was full of courage and faith. He served God faithfully. Now, a prophet was someone that God used to speak to people on his behalf. And in the Old Testament nation of Israel, God would send prophets to the kings of Israel to guide them into knowing God's will and following God's will. Because even though Israel had kings, God was their sovereign king. And so the king of Israel had a responsibility to God. And so he couldn't do whatever he wanted. But the problem was that outside of a few good kings like David or some others, most of the kings of ancient Israel weren't faithful to God. They wanted to do things their own way, and that caused some problems. And so whenever those kings would disregard God and lead the people away from God, then God would send them a prophet to warn the king and call the king back close to God. The prophet would be sent to hold the king accountable. So this relationship between the king and a prophet became very adversarial at times, and as a result, many of the kings didn't like the prophets and regularly had them killed. Enter Elijah, the greatest prophet in the Old Testament Jewish nation of Israel, who God sent to hold this wicked, evil king Ahab accountable for how he was leading God's people away from God. And the Jewish scriptures tell us that Ahab did more evil in the eyes of the Lord than any of the wicked kings who had come before him. So Ahab was the worst of the worst. Not only did he not care about God or being faithful to God or leading the nation to worship God, he introduced a multitude of completely new pagan gods, and he commanded the people of Israel to worship these idols instead of God. But as evil as Ahab might have been, it was who he married who was even more evil and who was even worse. You've heard her name before. He married Jezebel, daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Sidonians. Now, Jezebel was a woman who had a reputation not only for her idolatry, but also for her cruelty. She was every sort of evil and wicked. In fact, outside of Judas in the New Testament, there's probably no other name in Scripture whose name is more synonymous with evil than Jezebel. Along with her husband Ahab, she was a murderer, regularly killing God's prophets and priests, and she was manipulative and controlling. And in addition to worshiping other gods, she was a sorceress of her nation's pagan god, Baal. And together with Ahab, she and he ruled over the nation of Israel as king and queen. But as a result of their wickedness, God sent Elijah to confront them, and he instructed Elijah to pronounce a famine on the entire nation. And so Elijah obeyed, and he said to Ahab, "As the Lord, the God of Israel lives, whom I serve, there will neither be dew nor rain on the land in the next few years except at my word." And so this famine was judgment, and it was the direct result of Ahab and Jezebel's state-sponsored worship of pagan gods, namely the pagan god Baal, who was thought to be the sky god in charge of the weather and the rain. So through Elijah, God was demonstrating how he was greater than Baal. But the judgment that Elijah was pronouncing on Ahab and Jezebel's sin would be something that would cause the entire nation to suffer. The innocent would suffer right alongside of the guilty. And over the next 3 years, things got very bad and things got very dark. There's no rain, rivers and the streams dried up, lake levels dropped, food was hard to grow, it was scarce to find. People suffered. And when the famine got severe, Ahab and Jezebel sent the entire army on a search throughout the nation and even into the surrounding nations to find Elijah, to bring him back so he would end this famine and so that they could kill him. They blamed Elijah for it. They didn't see it was their responsibility. And so over the next 3 years, God was faithful to Elijah, and he told Elijah to go and hide and live in a cave by a brook. It's a remarkable story. God instructs him to live in this cave by a brook where he'd have water, and he sent ravens to feed Elijah every single day. And when the brook dried up, as the famine got very severe, he instructed Elijah to go live with a widow in a small town called Zarephath, and where he continued to provide for their daily needs in supernatural ways. It's an incredible story. God even used Elijah to raise this widow's son back to life after he died. So Elijah was this incredible prophet, incredible man of God who did supernatural things by God's power, which sets the stage for what happens next, because after 3 years, God tells Elijah to go back and to confront Ahab. And after a long time, scriptures tell us, in the 3rd year of the famine, the word of the Lord came to Elijah, "Go and present yourself to Ahab, and I will send rain on the land." So Elijah went. But by this point in the famine, because of Jezebel's cruelty and wickedness, word had reached Elijah of how Jezebel had killed off all the Lord's prophets. These were the ones that Elijah had trained and recruited and taught one by one. Systematically, Jezebel was eliminating them and installing her own pagan prophets over the nation. And so Elijah goes to meet Ahab, and when he saw Elijah, Ahab said to Elijah, "Is that you troubler of Israel?" And so it's clear that Ahab, over 3 years, things haven't changed. The famine hasn't changed the way that Ahab thinks. He blames Elijah for this problem. Elijah is the one to blame for this famine. And Elijah responds, he says, I've not made trouble for Israel. You and your father's family have. You've abandoned the Lord's commands. You've followed the pagan gods of the Baals. Then we're shown the reason for why God sent Elijah back to Ahab. Since Ahab didn't repent and return to the Lord, over those 3 years, God decided that he would deal directly with the idolatry in the nation himself. So God instructed Elijah to say to Ahab, summon the people from all over Israel to meet me on Mount Carmel and bring the 450 prophets of Baal and bring the 400 prophets of Asherah, who is the wife, the pagan god, who is the wife of Baal, and who all eat at Jezebel's table. So Elijah's like, okay, let's get everybody together and make sure that as many people in the nation can attend as possible. And make sure all the prophets of your pagan gods are there. All 450 of Baal's prophets, all 400 of his wife Asherah's prophets. Make sure that all 850 of them are there on that mountain, and you all meet me there, and we're going to see whose God is greater. And I'll summarize what happens next for the sake of time, but if you've never read this story, you've got to read this story because it's one of the most epic showdowns in the entire Old Testament Jewish scriptures. You've got this lone faithful prophet of God who hasn't been executed by Jezebel standing in this corner, and you've got 850 pagan prophets of Baal and Asherah standing in this corner. And once they all get and gather on top of Mount Carmel, Elijah doesn't waste any time or mince any words. He's like, okay, everyone, it's time to make a decision. If God is God, then worship him. If Baal is God, then worship him. So let's see which one is greater, which one is the true God. So the people go along with it, and the prophets go along with it, and Ahab goes along with it. And then Elijah says something that's very interesting that's going to make more sense in just a minute. Elijah said to them all, I'm the only one of the Lord's prophets left alive. But Baal's prophets, you have 450. And Asherah, you have 400 prophets. In other words, this is what he's saying. Jezebel, you might have gotten to everybody else, but you haven't gotten to me. It's me versus all of you. I'm the last one alive. It's me versus all of you. That was Elijah's state of mind. He thought he was the last prophet of God alive in the nation. He believed that all of his friends and all of those he had trained and all those he had taught were dead. And though it doesn't appear to affect him in this moment, soon in the story, we're going to see that it had a huge impact on Elijah. So Elijah instructs them to sacrifice 2 bulls, one for the prophets, the pagan prophets, and another one for him. And they were going to place these bulls on top of wood, but they weren't supposed to light it on fire. And so the test was that they would pray to their God, and whichever God answered by fire from heaven was the true God. So the prophets of Baal and Asherah, they spend the entire morning and the afternoon and the evening shouting and dancing and trying to conjure up the work of their gods to answer their prayers. They even resorted to cutting themselves, thinking that in hopes of seeing that their blood was being poured, that their God would be moved to respond. And the entire time I love this story, Elijah is taunting them, saying things to them like, well, maybe he's sleeping. Maybe he's deep in thought. Maybe he's just too busy. Maybe he's traveling. Maybe he's out of town. Maybe he's sitting on the toilet. It's hilarious. Shout louder. Surely he's a God, isn't he? Surely he can do something. But by the evening, after doing this all day, nothing had happened. And then it was Elijah's turn. But he made it harder for his God. He had them pour water all over the wood, all over the sacrifice. And in fact, he dug a trench and he had the water poured over and over until that it filled that trench up. And so it was just consumed and drenched. And before all these people and all these pagan prophets and in front of King Ahab, he makes a simple prayer. Lord, let it be known today that you are God in Israel and that I am your servant. And I've done all of this at your command. So answer me today, Lord. Answer me so these people will know that you are God and that you're turning their hearts back again. And after he made this prayer, scriptures tell us that then the fire of the Lord fell and it burned up the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, the soil, and it also licked up all the water that was in that trench. And when the people of Israel saw what God did, they all fell on the ground and they cried out, "The Lord, He is God. The Lord, He is God." It's an incredible moment. Nobody wavered on that day. They all saw for themselves the power and the might of God. And now, with the support of the people behind him, whose hearts were turning back to God, Elijah had all 850 of these pagan prophets killed. And in one day, God dealt himself with the idolatry in the nation. And then he sends rain and the famine ends. And you'd think that that would be the end of the story, but it's not. Because Ahab goes home and he tells Jezebel everything that had happened, all of what Elijah had done on top of Mount Carmel, and how all of the prophets of Baal and Asherah had been killed. These were the prophets of her gods. And so Jezebel, upset by this, Jezebel, who herself cruel and wicked and would stop at nothing to snuff out Elijah, sent a message to him and said, "May the gods deal with me, be it ever so severely, if by this time tomorrow I do not make your life like one of those prophets that you killed." In translation, Elijah, you just signed your death certificate. You are a marked man. By this time tomorrow, you will join them. You will be no more. And for some reason, that doesn't seem to make sense to me or to you, to any of us, after having just witnessed what God had done on top of Mount Carmel, and how God had used one man to end the idolatry in the nation, and how God had used Elijah to destroy all of these pagan prophets, and after how God had been supernaturally providing for Elijah over the 3 years of this famine, when Jezebel made this one simple threat to him, this bold, fearless prophet of God was afraid, and he ran for his life. And that fear and those feelings led him to run over 80 miles from this point. And he finally gets exhausted, and he comes to a tree, and he sat down under that tree, and he prayed that he might die. He said to God, "I've had enough, Lord. Take my life. I am no better than any of my sinful ancestors who failed." He's saying, "I've had enough, God. I can't do this anymore. After all these years, after all this struggle, after all this stress, after all this loss, after all this pain, after all this darkness, after all these feelings, after all of what I've had to endure, after what you just did on Mount Carmel, nothing has changed. And now Jezebel, who's killed all the other prophets of God, is after me, and she's going to get to me just like she got to all of them. So God, take my life. Don't give her the satisfaction of being the one who ends my life." He felt like he had failed, and that everything that he had done up until this point in his life had been a failure. It had come to nothing. He had hoped that after the events of what happened on top of Mount Carmel, that things would be different, but they're not. And here he was, a fugitive on the run, devastated by the darkness and by his feelings and by his emotions. He was controlled and consumed by them. And we see here a glimpse into Elijah's personal emotional state, that in his life, maybe this was his case for years, he struggled with discouragement. He struggled with depression, with feelings of insecurity and inadequacy, feeling unworthy, that he just would never amount to anything, that even if he did his best, it wouldn't change anything. He felt like a failure. And he felt like he was like all of his ancestors, just a sinner who had just never amounted to anything. He was plunged deeper into this darkness personally in his own life by his own feelings, which were in control of him. Just when he thought that the darkness would go away and everyone would repent and return to God, nothing changed. At least in his mind, nothing changed, and he blamed himself for it. If he had been better, maybe this wouldn't be the case. If he had been stronger, maybe the nation would be better. Maybe Ahab would have changed. And there, under that tree, with his emotions in control, he was asking to die because he was in a fight with his own feelings. Those feelings changed the way that he saw himself. Those feelings changed the way that he saw God. Those feelings that God had given him to enhance his life were now in control of his life and were taking him away from the life that he and God wanted. I mean, our feelings are powerful. Think about it. Here was this incredible man of faith who had been faithful to God for all these years and who had spoken for God to the nation, who had commanded the power of God, who had done supernatural things like stopping the rain and the dew, raising the dead, seeing God send fire from heaven, asking God to die. He was ready to give up. Giving up hope. Things couldn't change, couldn't get any better. He couldn't see clearly. He couldn't see God through this fog of his own feelings. His emotions were blinding him. And God loved Elijah and cared about Elijah's feelings, but he wanted to help also change Elijah's perspective, to get his eyes off his fears and his feelings that were fighting him and back onto God, back onto faith, so he could see clearly, so he could move forward, so he could take his next step. And so God, there under that tree, God sent an angel to him. And he gave him food to eat and something to drink. And the angel told Elijah to take a journey to another mountain called Mount Horeb, the same mountain that God met with Moses so many centuries before. Because there, God had a plan to show Elijah something that would change how he saw himself, how he saw God, and how he saw his circumstances. And so Elijah obeyed and he went on this journey that lasted many, many days. And once he arrived there, strengthened by that food, he reached Mount Horeb, the mountain of God. And there he went into a cave and he spent the night. And it was in this night in his life where he was alone in that cave that God showed up and he spoke to Elijah and he appeared in a way that was just going to radically change Elijah's perspective. The question that God asks him is so powerful and it's so personal and it's so penetrating. It exposes everything Elijah is feeling and the struggle that he's been dealing with his entire life. And I want you to hear this question because God's going to ask you this question before we're done this morning. The word of the Lord came to Elijah in that cave and he asks him this question: what are you doing here, Elijah? Now, don't get confused by this because it was God who told him to go to this mountain and be in this cave. God was the one who sent Elijah here. So this wasn't a question about geography, like why are you here in this cave? This was a question about why are you letting your emotions and your fears and your feelings control you? This was a spiritual and emotional question. Where are you? Why are you here spiritually? Why are where you are mentally, Elijah? Why are you allowing your feelings to have control over you? They're lying to you, Elijah. And God, who loves Elijah, who's already taken care of his physical needs with food and with water, is now tending and taking care of his spiritual and emotional and mental needs. What are you doing, Elijah? Your feelings are running your life. They've made a fog descend over you. They're controlling you. You can't see clearly anymore. You're stuck in them to the point where you think you're the only prophet left alive and you think nothing can ever change in Israel. And you feel like your ministry and all of your life is one big failure, that you've amounted to nothing and you've made no difference. And now because you're listening to your fears and your feelings, you want to die. You think you're unworthy. And it's led you into this dark depression, into this great discouragement. But Elijah, none of that is true. You need to see something that might change the way you're thinking. You need to see something that might change how you feel, that might change your perspective. It might help you. And so the Lord said to Elijah, I want you to go out of this cave and stand at the entrance. Stand there on the mountain in the presence of the Lord. In my presence, Elijah, I'm about to pass by. And then a great and powerful wind, as Elijah stood at the entrance to the cave, a great and powerful wind tore the mountains apart and shattered the rocks around Elijah before the Lord. But the Lord, scriptures tell us, wasn't in the wind. And after the wind came, there was this incredible earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake came a fire, the consuming fire of the presence of God. But God wasn't meeting with Elijah in that fire. No. After all of that, after the fire came a gentle whisper, a still small voice. When Elijah heard it, he pulled his cloak over his face and he went out and he stood in the presence of the Lord. And God asked Elijah the same question he had asked him inside that cave. What are you doing? God knew that in this darkness, where Elijah was fighting with his own feelings and his own fears, and he was at their mercy, struggling with his own discouragement, his own depression, feeling unworthy and like a failure, God knew that what Elijah needed most was a personal encounter with him. And so as incredible and as dramatic as the wind and the earthquake and the fire all was, God wasn't in those. God in this darkness, in this night, was in this gentle whisper. Elijah sensed God's presence with him through the still small voice of a personal one-on-one conversation that he had with God that reassured Elijah he was not alone. God was with him, and God was showing him what he needed to see to help him move forward through his fears and his feelings. I think sometimes in our life, we can want God to show up and do it in an undeniable, supernatural way that would prove to us that he is with us, that he cares about us, that he's going to walk with us through this, and we can miss the simple, quiet conversation that God wants to have with us when we're going through dark times, hard times. So as you walk through what you're walking through in your life, and as you fight with the feelings that you are feeling, what are you looking for? Are you looking for God in some supernatural, huge, big way, in the fire, the earthquake, in the wind? Are you waiting for God to move heaven and earth to rattle your world with his power to display to you that he's with you? Or are you slowing down and listening to the gentle whispers that God would speak to you into your heart and into your life that would help you see what's real and see what's true instead of what you fear, instead of what you're feeling, because God wants to talk to you. And all of what you feel and all of what you fear isn't always what's true. God would have something else to say, something that maybe you haven't considered. And Elijah sensed God's presence and heard God's voice. And Elijah responds to God as he had before. God, I've done everything I can. I've done everything right. Nothing has changed. The people haven't changed. They still reject you. Ahab and Jezebel, they're still out to get me. They're still in control. They've killed all the other prophets. I'm the only one alive, and they're trying to kill me too. It's important that you understand that in this moment with God, God lets Elijah vent all of the pain and all of the fears and all of the feelings that he had. Even if they weren't all true and even if they weren't all real, God doesn't condemn Elijah. God doesn't criticize Elijah. God doesn't tell him just to have more faith or to just suck it up and move on. No, God cared for Elijah. He listened to Elijah. He met with him and he encouraged Elijah. And as a result, something happened in this moment with God inside of Elijah's heart and life. It changed. It switched the way that he saw himself and the way that he saw God and the way that he saw how God was using him. Something changed how he felt. Now his fears and his feelings were pushed aside. And in this darkness, he could see God clearer and he could hear God, and his faith increased and he was encouraged. And when his perspective wasn't any longer on his fear or his feelings, it was then he could hear what God wanted to say that would give Elijah the help that he needed and the purpose that he needed to move forward and take another step. And he couldn't see it before, but now God had changed his perspective, because before Elijah would be finished in his life as a prophet and be with the Lord, he needed to anoint a new king over Israel, one who would replace Ahab and Jezebel and who God would use to deal justice to both of them. And he needed to anoint a brand new prophet to take his place, one who would go on to continue to do the work Elijah had started. But before God was finished talking with Elijah in this night, he added one more thing. One more thing. Oh yeah, Elijah, you know how you felt like you were the only one in Israel who's left alive, who's faithful to God? You remember how you felt like you're the last remaining prophet alive? Remember how you felt like your life hasn't made a difference and how you felt like after everything you've done, you've failed and been a failure? Remember those fears and those feelings that led you to be so discouraged and so depressed? Just so you know, Elijah, now that you see me clearly, now that you can see clearer now you see what's true through these fog of your feelings, the truth is your life hasn't been a failure. You're not a failure. Now let me show you what your feelings wouldn't let you see before. I've used you in ways you can't imagine. There are still other prophets left alive. You're not the only one left. In fact, you're not the only righteous follower of God left in the nation. Your life and your ministry has made a difference, Elijah. There are still 7,000 people in Israel who have not bowed their knee to Baal. And that's because of you. That's because of your influence. You've made a difference. You're not the only one left. That's your fear talking. That's your feelings talking. Don't let them be in control of your life. Let me be in control of your life. They don't speak the truth. Your fears and your feelings, they don't speak the truth. The truth is, I am with you. I am using you, and you have made a difference. You're not the only one left. My movement will continue long after you're gone. You've been faithful. You can trust me. Everything you've done will result in something good. I promise. And Elijah would go on to become one of the greatest Old Testament spiritual leaders in Israel. That's exactly what Elijah needed to hear. It encouraged him to help him move forward. And I think it's encouraging for you and for me, because I think we can all relate to Elijah, whether we're a church person or not. When we go through dark times, we experience fear and feelings, and they become so large and so overwhelming that we can easily feel stuck in them, or we can't seem to move and get beyond them. And those feelings that God has given to us to enhance our life have become what is used to take us away from the life that we want. But this story shows us that God will show up in our lives and in our darkness too. And He will come close with us, and He will encourage us, and He will speak with us. And if we're willing, He will care for us, and He will help us, and He will let us vent out all of our fears and all of our frustrations and all of our feelings, because He's a safe God and He cares about you. And then in His own gentle, loving way, He'll encourage you and He'll speak truth to you, and He'll give you what you need to know to take your next step forward. So you don't have to stay stuck in fear or in your feelings. Though life was dark, Elijah found that God had given him a new perspective, and he was able to move forward. He would no longer cower to fear or his feelings. His perspective was now anchored to God and to God's truth about him, about his plan, about what he was doing. Faith settled Elijah's fears. Faith overcame all of those feelings that wanted to destroy him. Faith fought and won the battle for Elijah. And as a result, in Elijah's life, he could see God better. He could see himself more clearly, and he knew what next step to take. And so if life is dark for you, then you need to know that when darkness descends in our lives, like Elijah, it's going to fight us. It's going to fight our faith. It's going to feed all of our fears and all of our insecurities. Sometimes our life will get dark and we can't do anything to stop it. And even if we've done everything right, whether we have great faith or not, we still find ourselves in places where we don't want to be. And here's Elijah, this incredible man of God who's done everything right, finding himself in the middle of a darkness he didn't want to be in, a dark night of the soul. And that darkness brought a fight to his life and to his heart and to his feelings and to his thoughts that he just couldn't overcome on his own. And if we're not careful, those feelings that we experience when we go through hard times in our life, we can get stuck in them too. They can become our house. They can become how we see everything around us, how we see God, how we see ourselves, how we see the future. We can, like Elijah, give up hope, and we can become desperate. Life won't ever change. It won't ever get any better. The feelings that God has given us that we're supposed to enhance our life have become the thing that has taken us away from the life that we want. We've been stuck there. And in his darkness, Elijah battled his own fears and his own feelings. And when life gets dark for you, you will too. All of your trust, all of your hope, all of your faith are going to find themselves in a fight with your fear and your feelings in the darkness. And the darkness just seems to stoke the fires of all of our fears, feeding them more and more and more until they grow so large and so big that they start pushing us around until they gain control over our lives. See, when your life gets dark, your faith will have a fight. Your fears and your feelings will become stronger than you, and they'll become bigger than you, and maybe that's where you are right now. And if you're not careful, then all of those fears and those feelings that God has given you will take control, and they will destroy you. Your hope, your relationships, the future. For Elijah, he dealt with discouragement and insecurity. He felt unworthy. He felt like he was never good enough. These things were always there in his life, lurking under the surface, trying to get out to wreak havoc in his life. They became so big and so dark. It caused him to be so discouraged and depressed, he wanted to die. What about you? What's your battle? What emotions and what feelings do you struggle with that if you'll let them, they're working to destroy everything important to you? The life that you want, the marriage that you want, the career that you want, the relationship with your kids that you want, the financial peace and freedom that you want, the life of purpose that you want. We all fight something. We all struggle with something. For me, like Elijah, I struggle with insecurity and inadequacy. I've never thought I was good enough. I battle with negativity and an undercurrent of perfectionism in my life that's crippling, and nothing is good enough because I don't ever feel good enough. And it's led me to be anxious in my life and worried all the time. And like I'm a failure and like I'm never going to be good. And it's made me feel impatient with people in my life. It's caused me to get angry. It's caused me to be uncaring and unkind. When my fears and my feelings are in control, I can be a very difficult person to be around. And if I let them, those feelings and those fears will destroy the life that I want, the family that I want, the ministry that I want. And you're in a battle too. That's why you have to be prepared, because God, who loves you and who has a plan for your life, doesn't want your fear or your feelings to control you. He wants to be the leader. He wants to be the Lord of your life. Your feelings don't make a very good God. They're not as good or as kind or as patient or as loving as God is. And sometimes without realizing it, our fears and our feelings can become God in our life. They can take control. They become bigger than us and push us around. And that's why we need God's help, because those feelings will destroy the life that both you and God want. Elijah, this incredible man of God, found himself in this dark place, needing God. You and I find ourselves there too. And if Elijah needed God, I guarantee you, I need God and you need God when we find ourselves there. And it doesn't matter who we are, it doesn't matter what we believe about God, we all need God's help to move us forward when we feel stuck like that. We need God to meet with us, to speak to us, to show up, to tell us what we need to know and see so that we can move forward in faith, because God has always wanted faith to be the perspective that you live your life by, not feelings, not fears. And so even if your life is dark, if you will come close to God, then God can change your perspective too, away from fear and your feelings to faith in Him. And when that happens, it will change everything. God asked Elijah a simple question: what are you doing? Why are your fears and your feelings in control over you? Why have they become bigger than me? Aren't I your God? Aren't I greater than them, Elijah? And Elijah, he came close to God and he heard God's truth, and it changed the way that he saw everything. And it helped him let go of those fears and those feelings, to know that God loved him and cared for him and wanted to help him find freedom in his life. And I think that there's somebody watching today who needs to hear that God is there for you, and He wants to meet with you right now and to speak into your heart and into your life and to help you find the freedom you can't give yourself from the things that want to steal away the life that you and both God want for you. God, who gave you those feelings, doesn't want you to be controlled by them. He doesn't want those feelings to rule over your life. But for years, you have let your emotions and your fears and your insecurities and your feelings run your life. And they have stolen the life that you wanted, and the family that you wanted, and the peace that you wanted, and the hope that you wanted, the career maybe that you wanted, maybe the faith that you wanted. Today, if you will just come close to God, if you'll just listen to what He might be saying to you, maybe you'll hear the same thing. What are you doing? Don't you know I'm greater than all of your fears and all of your feelings? Don't bow to them. Don't cower to them. Don't let them wreak havoc in your life. I'm here to help you move forward. I'm here to change the way you see everything so you can take your next step. And you don't have to live your life stuck under the control of your feelings any longer. If you come close to God, He will help you find the freedom you can't give yourself. And faith in Him will set you free. And what you'll find in God is a much better, much more loving, much more patient, much more kind God in your life than your feelings and your fears. And his plan today is to meet with you so he can show you what you need to see to change the way you see everything, the way you see him, the way you see you, the way you see your future. And all of us can come close to God now because of Jesus, who is God's Son and who came and who died on the cross and who rose from the dead because he loves you and I, because he wants to have a relationship with you and I, one that gives you freedom and victory in your life, that walks with you through everything and that helps you to see what you need to see and where he shows himself faithful to you so you can trust him more and so you can live your life with a perspective that isn't overwhelmed by fear and feelings, but conquers it by faith. So right now, you can turn to God in your darkness with all your questions, with all your fears, with all your feelings. And you'll find that God will meet with you because he loves you and he will listen to you and he will comfort you and he will change the way you see everything, just like he did with Elijah. And you will be able to say, like Elijah, that God really does his best work when life gets dark. Can I pray for you this morning? Lord, I love you. And I know that those who are watching this morning, they trust you. And today you're turning their hearts back to you, away from our fears and away from our feelings, the ones that want to destroy us, the ones that work to take us away from the life that you want for us, that we want for us. And whether we're a church person or not this morning, my prayer is that, Lord, you would help us turn to you, that you would give us the ability to trust and to believe. And as we do, as we turn to you this morning, Lord, maybe if it's for the first time and we admit our need and we confess our need to be forgiven and we acknowledge that Jesus, you really are the Son of God who loves us and we ask you to forgive us. Or whether we're a church person and we're turning to you again because we want you to help us have freedom in our life, whatever it might be, Lord, as we turn to you today, give us the ability to find the kind of peace and the kind of hope that comes from seeing you clearly in the darkness that we're walking through. And our fears and our feelings, they don't get the final word. You get the final word because you overcame the grave. You came out of that tomb and you get the final word because you are the real, true Lord and leader, the one who can give us the life we can't give ourselves. So help us today. Turn to you. Give us the life we can't give ourselves and give us the wisdom to live our lives with a different perspective than our fear and our feeling. I pray it in Jesus' name. Amen. Hey, thanks for being with us this morning for this next message in our series, Night. Join us next Sunday as we wrap up our series, Night.